Well, welcome to our February lecture here of the Lewis House Lecture Series. So glad that you all could be here tonight. I do want to say a word up front. As you know, our lecture series, we cover so many important topics and themes and that people are talking about that are important for Christians to think about, or sometimes we try to cover things that we think people aren't talking about but need to be talking about. And when I think about tonight in particular, to be honest, I'm hesitant to even use the term topic or theme because this is such a personal night that this is people's lives and as individuals and how they see themselves, that it's just an immensely personal night, that topic or theme doesn't quite seem to hit the personal note of why this is such an important conversation for tonight. Because at Lewis House, again, let me set this vision for us. We are here to think well so that we love well. Thinking in the service of love is often what we talk about why have the conversations, why read the things that we read, debate the things that we debate, talk about the things we do, is because in our time, and in all times really, but particularly in our age, there are just so many things that we need to think carefully about as Christians so that we can love well. Think well so that we can love well. Think like Jesus so that we can love like Jesus. That is the goal of Lewis House. And so we're honored tonight to have with us Dr. Abigail Favale. And Dr. Favale is professor of the practice, theology, and literature at the University of Notre Dame's McGrath Institute for Church Life. She holds a concurrent appointment in the Department of Theology where she teaches on topics like Edith Stein's theology of woman and religion and literature. As a professor, her work lies at the intersection of Catholic theology, literature, and women's studies. Her abiding interest as a writer and scholar is the meaning and dignity of woman, and her work explores sexual difference and embodiment in the Catholic imagination. Dr. Favale has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from George Fox University, as well as a master's degree in women, writing, and gender, and a Ph.D. in English literature from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Her first book, Incarnation and Contemporary Women's Fiction, was awarded the 2014 Feminist and Women's Studies Association Book Award. Her second book is Into the Deep, An Unlikely Catholic Conversion, published by Cascade in 2018. It's a spiritual memoir that traces her journey from birthright evangelicalism to postmodern feminism, and finally to being a Catholic and being a part of the Catholic Church. Dr. Favale's most recent book, The Genesis of Gender, A Christian Theory, was published in 2022 by Ignatius Press and has already been translated into multiple languages. Her numerous essays have appeared in the McGrath Institute for Church Life's Church Life Journal, which is a fabulous little online journal. If you haven't checked out the Church Life Journal, you should. She's also published in The Atlantic, First Things, Public Discourse, Comment, and elsewhere. Dr. Favale is also a fiction writer and has been awarded the J.F. Powers Prize for Short Fiction in 2017. We're honored to have with us tonight Dr. Abigail Favale.
Hello. A lot of you are here. I'm kind of surprised. I don't know that I would have left my recliner on a night like this, to be honest. So I appreciate your sacrifice. I hope I can make it worth your while. But I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to make sure my clicker works. Ooh, it does. All right, well, one of the challenges of talking about gender in our current moment is that there are multiple and contradictory definitions on offer. What is gender? Is gender a synonym for sex? Is gender a social construct? Is gender an innate sense of self? People are using the same term, but with wildly different meanings, and thus we often find ourselves talking past each other. So in this brief talk, I hope to do two things. First, I want to provide an orientation to the confusing and conflicted gender landscape, introducing you to the two dominant theories about gender in our contemporary moment. Secondly, I hope to illuminate how a Christian view compares with those two theories, namely in the understanding of sexual difference as both a natural and sacramental reality. So let's begin by looking at, there we go, okay. The social constructionist understanding of gender, which is a theory that emerged in the 20th century and was, until recently, I would argue, the predominant view in the world of secular gender studies. I often start this theory's genealogy with Simone de Beauvoir, a French feminist philosopher. And that might seem strange, considering that Simone de Beauvoir didn't actually use the term gender. Her famous book on the topic is called The Second Sex. But in that work, she introduces the concept that the term gender would soon come to name. That concept is best captured in her well-known line, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." That statement is the mustard seed of constructionist gender theory. When de Beauvoir writes that one is not born but becomes a woman, she's driving a wedge between the idea of woman and female, arguing that woman is a social and cultural fabrication that is projected onto the biological reality of femaleness. Second-wave feminists, in particular, latched onto this distinction that she was making. Instead of relying simply on sex to classify men and women, they imported the term gender in order to distinguish between sex as a basic biological reality and gender as a collection of socially constructed norms and ideals that are associated with each sex and mistakenly read as natural. This is the classic sex-gender split, the second-wave feminist understanding of sex and gender that I inherited when I began my feminist studies 2 decades ago. Sex refers to biology, and gender refers to the social meanings attached to sex. So feminists saw this concept of gender as providing a site of resistance to essentialism, which in feminist studies is the claim that men and women are innately different, that we differ at the level of nature. Now, one can understand why this distinction has its appeal. At times in our culture, differences between the sexes have been translated into rigid, sex-specific roles, sometimes, often, unfortunately, creating a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority in favor of men. Culturally bound assumptions about women have at times been too easily naturalized, seen as innate and inevitable, rather than distortions of culture. An easy example, especially given our proximity to a university, might be the assumption that women are less rational than men and so therefore should not have access to higher education, right, which was an assumption that existed for a long time. So feminists saw this concept of gender as a helpful tool that would enable them to better draw that distinction and articulate that difference between what is cultural and what actually is rooted in biology. However, in the late 1980s, this kind of tidy distinction between sex and gender begins to unravel, thanks largely to the work of Judith Butler, who really is the godmother of gender theory. So Butler, in her earlier work, ups the ante of social constructionism, asserting that biological sex itself is a social fabrication. Right, so here's a quote from one of her books. "Female no longer appears to be a stable notion. Its meaning is as troubled and unfixed as woman." To put it simply, Butler's kind of arguing that, well, sex really is just gender, too. So Butler is leaning into many of the ideas asserted by Simone de Beauvoir, but she takes them to new extremes. Near the end of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir says, "Nothing is natural." Now, for Butler, that statement is really a foundational premise of her philosophy. The idea that humankind is characterized by two sexes that are biologically complementary is a social fiction rather than a matter of fact. Because of this, Butler's early philosophy can be described as anti-realist. So truth is suspended in air quotes as something that's ultimately unknowable, or perhaps even non-existent. All that remains is power, Knowledge, then, is not a matter of discerning or recognizing what is true, because truth itself is a construction of power. So gender theory in this mode is radically constructionist. It rejects the idea that sex and gender, or terms like female, male, man, woman, constructionist gender theory rejects the idea that those words name something real. Instead, those concepts are seen as social constructs that create the illusion of something real. Once this distance between bodily sex and identity was enabled via gender in the 20th century, it did not take long, in fact, just merely a few decades, for gender to shift meaning once again, becoming entirely disconnected from sex. And this disconnection paved the way for an even more fragmented understanding of the human person to emerge. A theory that is centered on a subjective understanding of gender, often called gender identity. So what is this theory, and how does it compare to constructionist gender theory? How many of you have seen this infograph before? It's pretty common, right? It kind of circulates in educational settings especially. I find it to be a very helpful distillation of subjectivist gender theory. So according to this theory, one's identity as a man or woman, or both or neither, is based primarily on one's subjective self-perception. And that's illustrated or kind of symbolically indicated by the thought bubble with the rainbow in it, right? That is where one's manness or womanness reside, right? Not in the organization of the body, but in the thought bubble. So in cases of a felt incongruence between one's gender identity and one's sex, this model affirms the thought bubble, the subjective sense of gender, over the objective fact of biological sex. So this theory separates gender, or manness and womanness, from sex, rooting sex identity in self-perception rather than the body. Now, in order for this theory to seem plausible, in order for us to be convinced that female is a feeling, we have to unlearn the obvious and rather intuitive truth that the human species has two sexes, male and female. And this unlearning is being facilitated in large part by the manipulation of language. So take the phrase sex assigned at birth. This is really common HR terminology now. You probably checked a box to apply to college that asked for your sex assigned at birth. Now, the word assigned here is philosophically loaded. It conveys the idea that biological sex is something that is imposed by a physician at birth, rather than an objective reality that is recognized and recorded at birth. Now, this phrase, assigned at birth, has an interesting history. It was developed and once used only in reference to very complex congenital disorders of sexual development that resulted in a kind of apparent sexual ambiguity at birth. In those very rare cases, doctors would sometimes initially assign or anticipate what sex would develop because the maleness or femaleness of the baby wasn't readily apparent. But in gender subjectivism, in the waters we're swimming in now, that terminology is now used in reference to all births, as if every human being is born sexually ambiguous. And that opens the way for sexed categories, like male and female, to be redirected from naming the organization of the body to that subjective sense of self. Now, some of you smart cookies out there might already be picking up on perhaps an interesting tension or paradox. The idea that gender is a social construct, something that is imposed upon us by society, is pretty different from the idea that gender is a real, innate, immutable identity that one accesses through self-perception. In fact, I would argue that those are two contradictory ideas. Right? On the one hand, gender as a social construct views gender as something that is extrinsic to the self. It's outside of us. It's social in origin. It's artificial And it's actually oppressive, right? Going earlier gender theory, the point was to kind of deconstruct gender. It was this kind of oppressive regime that holds us back. So gender is extrinsic, artificial, and oppressive. But in today's terminology, where I think gender subjectivism has become more prominent, gender is viewed as something intrinsic, within the self, deeply real. It's authentic. It's who you really are. And it's liberating. It's not oppressive. It's liberating to realize and express your inner sense of gender. So how do these ideas cohere? Now, okay, you could try to really steel man this and say, all right, well, maybe we internalize social constructs and they become something like innate identities. But that's not what proponents of gender subjectivism say. No, they argue that gender identity is a truth so profound that you can realize it at a young age, and it might actually be at odds with your socialization as a girl or a boy. So doesn't have an origin in socialization. And if there's any incongruence, it's the body that should be changed and brought into alignment with the inner truth. So according to gender subjectivism, the self-concept is real and immutable, but the body is malleable. The body might be a lie. So I would argue that these are really two different ideas of gender that are deeply in tension. But yet they share something in common. How did we get from one theory to the other, right? If I'm arguing that they're kind of in tension or even contradictory. Constructionism is anti-essentialist after all, whereas subjectivism often seems to actually make realist or essentialist claims about gender, right? She is a girl trapped in a boy's body, or trans women are women. Those are kind of realist claims about who we are, about being. So I would argue there's a reification turn happening here. So to reify means to make real. So I think part of what has happened is that the radical social constructionism dethroned the reality of sexual difference, or our perception of the reality. I mean, it's still a reality. And this anti-realism cleared the way for a new realism based not on the objective, intelligible, sensible world, but on one's subjective sense of self. So I think we're seeing two moves in this unfolding conceptual revolution. First, deconstruction, and then reification. So what is taken to be real is dismantled through constructionist gender theory. Then in its place, a reconfigured understanding of reality is asserted. So I think that's a simple, kind of perhaps too simplistic description of how I think we go from constructionism to subjectivism. Now, what's fascinating to me, especially as a long-time student of gender theory and feminist theory, is that this shift brings us to a bewildering reversal of the sex-gender split, right? If you remember earlier in my lecture, the second wave feminist framing that sex refers to biology, gender refers to culture. Well, now we live in a time where sex is the construct, but gender, in a subjective sense, is what's real. So it's flipped. Now, another layer of confusion here, if this isn't enough, is that there has not been a clean break between these two theories, between constructionism and subjectivism. Instead, what we have is this mishmash of the two. So both definitions of gender are routinely offered in contemporary discourse, sometimes by the same person, sometimes even in the same sentence. So there's this almost constant equivocation about what gender is. Gender is a social construct. No, gender is an innate sense of self. So one recent example of this is from the Associated Press style guidelines that I think came out in, I'm not sure, 2023, maybe 2022. But fairly recently, in the last couple of years. And so in these style guidelines, we get several different definitions of gender. So on one hand, we get this definition of gender. I'll read it to you. The first sentence. A social construct, okay, so ding, constructionism, encompassing a person's behaviors, intrinsic identity, and appearance. Okay, so this is kind of valiant attempt to sort of shove it all into one sentence, okay? So we've got the social construct, but then we also have the intrinsic identity, okay? Which again, those are kind of mutually exclusive options, right? So we get that sort of three-headed definition. But then later, even in the same style guidelines, we get yet another definition when we look at the definition of gender identity. And here we have a very straightforward subjectivist definition. Gender identity is a person's sense of feeling male, female, both, or neither, or some combination of both. Often just gender will suffice, okay? So here we get yet another definition of gender, which is really just equated with the subjectivist theory. So this is a really good example of what I'm talking about with this kind of equivocation and confusion. So not this clean break from constructionism to subjectivism, but this kind of mishmash of the two. So that's where we are. In a cultural moment where both constructivism and subjectivism are on offer, but with the latter, I would argue, now eclipsing the former. In fact, interestingly, Judith Butler's most latest book, which came out last year, tempers some of her early constructionist claims in order to better accommodate gender subjectivism. So this shift is even apparent in her own work. Now, there are seeds of truth in these theories. Both constructionism and subjectivism offer some half-truths. It is true that there are cultural expressions of sexual difference that are not strictly biological, but rather constructs of culture, and vary across cultures and through different moments in history. Some of these constructions or expressions of gender are beautiful. Some are benign. Some are harmful. And being able to make that distinction between what is cultural and what is natural is helpful and important. And similarly, subjectivism is getting at something that's really true about human beings. We experience our sex identity differently than other animals because we are self-aware, rational, reflective, spiritual beings. There's this rich subjective dimension to being a sexed human being. I can contemplate the meaning of my own womanhood in a way that my cat does not. There's a branch of philosophy, of Christian philosophy, called personalism. And this particular branch of philosophy places great importance on this subjective dimension of being human. But even Christian personalism does not overlook or deny the objective reality of our nature, which is what both constructionism and subjectivism do in their purest forms. They take what is one aspect of our personhood and make it absolute. So the shared lie, two truths and a lie, the shared lie on which they depend is this: the deconstruction of sexual difference, a rejection of the intrinsic meaning and dignity of the sexed body. And it is this obfuscation of sexual difference, that is the major point of departure between a Christian understanding of gender and contemporary gender theories. Which brings me to the second half of my talk. The Christian understanding of gender, which is grounded in both reason and revelation. In this view, in this way of seeing, gender is both a natural reality. It's something we can observe and understand at the level of reason. And it is also a sacramental reality. It carries sacred significance, which we can apprehend through the light of revelation. So first, let's take a look at gender as a natural reality. The etymological root of the word gender is gens. Right? It's a root you can see in words like generation or genealogy or genesis. In the verb form, gens refers to begetting. In the noun form, it signifies offspring or kin. So the root meaning of gender then is connected to generativity. It names the reality that there are two kinds of humans that are necessary for generation, the male and the female. There is not then, in the Christian view, a separation between sex and gender. Now, this is important. Separating gender from sex, or to put it differently, woman from female or man from male, this undermines the fundamental unity of the human person, who is a union. Our nature is a union of body and soul. So our body profoundly matters to who we are. So for our purposes today, for the rest of my talk, since I am kind of speaking in a Christian mode, I'll be using the terms gender and sex more or less interchangeably. And that's because I want to reaffirm this connection between woman and female, man and male. So to understand gender as a natural reality, we need to understand what sex is. We need a refresher. So as I mentioned earlier, much of the confusion and equivocation about gender in our time depends upon obfuscating the reality of sex, presenting sex as some ambiguous, scalar phenomenon that is so complex and mysterious that we simply can't make objective judgments about it. But my friends, that is not true. Sex is quite simple to define and can, in almost all cases, be readily observed. Sex refers to the organization of the body according to generative potential. And the definitions that Aristotle gave us over 2,000 years ago still hold true. A woman is the kind of human being who has the innate potential to generate within herself. And a man is the kind of human being who has the innate potential to generate outside of himself. This definition still holds, but in our time we should be prepared to respond to two common objections. The first objection: what about infertility? This is a very understandable objection, one I would have once made myself. How is it acceptable to define men and women by generative potential, given that not everyone is fertile, and no one, in fact, is always fertile? The answer to this objection depends upon the meaning of the word potential. So when I'm using that term, I'm using it in a technical and philosophical way. By potential, I mean an inherent capacity that exists whether or not it is ever actualized. Every woman has the potential to generate life within. Her entire physiology is organized, directed toward that potential. There are, of course, conditions that prevent that potential from resulting in actual generation. And those instances can be profound sources of pain. Precisely because there is a telos to the body that is being thwarted. We do not say that a man is infertile because he's unable to get pregnant, because he does not have that innate potential, but a woman does. So even the category of infertility gestures back to the distinctive procreative capacities of each sex. A man who has sex but can't get pregnant is not going to be treated at a fertility clinic for that, right? Because he doesn't have that innate potential to begin with. So rather than an argument for the opposition, the case of the infertile man or woman actually reaffirms the definition that I've provided. But what about intersex conditions? This is by far the most common objection I hear. Sex is not binary. Intersex people exist. The term intersex here is used in a way to suggest that it refers to something completely beyond the male-female binary, as if there is perhaps a third sex or a non-sexed category of persons who are neither male or female, or who somehow are both male and female at once. Used in this way, the intersex card, so to speak, can be played to justify the idea that the sex binary is a construct, and that opens the door then to gender subjectivism. So let me briefly clarify what intersex conditions are and what they are not, because there's a lot of confusion around this topic. And I think a misunderstanding of intersex conditions is at the root of a lot of confusion about sex in our time. The term intersex refers to a range of over a dozen different conditions that somehow affect the sexual reproductive system. The technical term most used by the medical establishment is disorders of sexual development, or DSDs. So these are objectively diagnosable physiological conditions. That's important. They refer to something that is atypical about the body. Now, they are best understood as variations within the categories of male and female, rather than exemptions from them. And in fact, many DSDs are sex-specific. So only males, for example, can develop Klinefelter syndrome. So they're best understood as variations within maleness and femaleness. Now, how common are DSDs? There's an oft-quoted statistic out there that greatly exaggerates the prevalence of DSDs, that claims that 1.7% of people are intersex, as many as have red hair. Perhaps you've heard that stat thrown around. That comes from the work of biologist Anne Fausto Sterling, a biologist whose work I studied in graduate school. And her work is heavily influenced by constructionist gender theory. She gets at that statistic by defining as intersex any deviation from, and this is a direct quote, the Platonic ideal of male and female. So this is an overly capacious definition that would include a huge range of conditions, including something like polycystic ovarian syndrome, right? With women who develop this have higher rates than other women of testosterone, higher levels of testosterone. But they're clearly female. Many of them have children, right? But they would definitely be a deviation from the Platonic ideal. So it's a huge definition. While the term intersex is used rhetorically to imply sexual ambiguity, in reality, and this is probably the most important thing I'll say about intersex conditions, the vast majority of people with intersex conditions are unambiguously male or female. The vast majority of intersex conditions do not result in sexual ambiguity. Very complex DSDs that do result in apparent sexual ambiguity at birth are extremely rare. They occur in 0.018% of live births. To flip the stat, that means that in 99.982% of births, sex is unambiguous and readily recognizable at birth. And that honestly surprises me, considering how complex the sexual development process is and how many things could go awry. But nonetheless, the sex binary is not a spectrum. It's not this complex, mysterious phenomenon that we just can't quite understand, but it's a remarkably stable binary. So from the vantage point of reason, then, we can understand gender as a natural reality, and one that is bodily, that is visible, that is grounded in generative potential. But that's not all. In the Christian understanding, gender is not only a natural reality, but it is also a sacramental one. And this is why I love being Christian. I love thinking and seeing as a Christian, because I get to absorb all that reason can tell me. I can observe and explore the order and beauty and complexity of nature. But I also know that there is a higher order of beauty and complexity, of which nature is only a sign. However wonderful the natural world is, it is not absolute. It is not self-creating and self-sustaining. Its beauty and order carry a greater signifying meaning. Nature points beyond itself to the things of God. What I'm describing here, in theological terms, if I can get my slide to, is the sacramental principle, which in its most basic form holds that the visible reveals the invisible. The visible world of nature reveals and mediates the hidden realities of God. Material realities are windows into the divine, and this is no less true. In fact, I would argue that it is more true of gender itself. The world, even and especially our bodies, are sacred signs, icons that reveal the reality of a loving God, a God who is seeking to make himself known. So what then is this sacred meaning of sexual difference? What does it reveal? Clearly, it holds profound temporal significance as the sole means by which human beings come into existence. But that earthly meaning points to a higher spiritual meaning. Sexual difference serves a sacramental purpose. It is an integral part of how we image God. In his series of homilies known as the Theology of the Body, Catholic philosopher and Pope and Saint John Paul II writes that the human being appears in the visible world as the highest expression of the divine gift. And he's using man here in a generic sense, meaning the human person, male and female. So according to John Paul II, the very sacramentality of creation, the sacramentality of the world, is revealed in the human person created in the image of God. And moreover, he writes, it is through our bodiliness, our masculinity and femininity, that the human person becomes a visible sign of the economy of truth and love, which has its source in God himself. Gender, then, is a visible sign of the relationship between God and humankind, which is a gift that springs forth from the union of truth and love. In his Theology of the Body, John Paul II draws deeply from the Genesis creation accounts, as well as other parts of Scripture, which depict a dynamic between God and creation that is best characterized by gift, a dynamic that carries throughout the Old and New Covenants, that culminates in the incarnation and Christ's sacrifice of love, his self-gift on the cross. God is the ultimate giver, the generous source of being, and our ultimate calling is to say yes to his gift. This dynamic of gift is etched into our very nature as men and women. As JP2 puts it, sexual difference is the original sign of a creative donation, a creative giving. Thus, he writes, there is a strong link between the mystery of creation as a gift that springs forth from love and man's existence, the human being's existence as male and female. Let me try to paraphrase what he's saying here. My female body, as a woman, visibly signals the capacity, the potential for motherhood. Yet that potential on its own is dormant. It can only be actualized by male generativity, and vice versa. Our distinct generative powers, then, in order to become fruitful, require the generosity of the other and our receptivity of that gift. We receive the generative potential of the other as we give of our own generative potential. So there's this dynamic of generosity and receptivity. Thus, man and woman, with our co-generative powers, have the unique capacity to form an interpersonal communion that can bring forth new life. This is a reflection of the divine. It's part of how we are in God's image. The Christian understanding of God as Trinity is that God is an interpersonal communion who is life-giving. And through our sexual differentiation, we image the triune God in a profound way. We image that dynamic of love and gift that is internal in the Trinity. The sexes are then a primordial sacrament of the divine economy of gift. This generative meaning of the body is connected to the body's nuptial meaning. Generation, after all, is brought about by a bodily union between two persons, and not just any two will do. A whole person generative union is made possible only by sexual difference, by maleness and femaleness, by a bodily difference that is ordered toward the difference of another. Gender is thus also a sign of the nuptial character of divine human communion. All throughout Scripture, God's relationship with humankind is depicted as nuptial, as marital. initially in the covenant with Israel and then culminating in the union of Christ and the church. And this is yet another way that sexual difference carries a higher iconic meaning. These are not mere symbols, empty and arbitrary, but on the contrary, reveal something profound about ultimate reality, about our true destiny, union with God, union that in Scripture is described as a marriage, a union of bridegroom and bride. In a sacramental Christian understanding, then, gender is part of God's self-revelation, his self-disclosure through the visible world. He speaks to us in a kind of image language. He speaks to us in visible signs and symbols, including the signs of our bodies. Both of the secular theories of gender I discussed earlier obscure this sacramentality of the body. Gender subjectivism, after all, defines gender as subjective and thus an invisible reality. This disrupts the sacramental dynamic, right, which is the visible revealing the invisible. It erases the body's visible sacramental meaning. And if gender is only a construct, well, it tells us nothing about the things of God. It is merely our own projection, a human projection, a kind of funhouse mirror of our own fantasies that reveal nothing of the divine. Building suspense here for my last slide. Okay. The truth, my friends, is so much better. We are living icons. You, yes, you, all of you, you are a living icon. My beloved sister who hates looking at herself in the mirror, you are a living icon. My beloved brother who feels intense distress about being male, you are a living icon. My brothers and sisters who are ravaged by disease or age or injury, you still, in your very being, reveal the things of God. And this is the truth about gender, the beautiful truth that our faith gives us, a truth that we must cultivate in our hearts and carry into the world with boldness and delight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Favale. Folks, we are going to do a time of Q&A. So if you can, myself and my friend Jansen here in the back, one of our scholars, we have some mics. If you could please, if you have a question, stand up. We'll get to you the best we can in order as we see you raise your hand. Raise your hand, we'll come to you, stand up, ask you a question. Simple as that.
I first off want to thank you for this talk. It's a very, very important talk. So thank you. I came from Cincinnati.
Oh,
so
cool.
we got some people here from Cincinnati. What do you make of the person that, and I'm sure some of you can relate to this, the person that's so demoralized and fed up with all of the talk about gender, saying, how about we just jettison the word gender altogether?
Yeah.
And just ignore it, or just say it doesn't matter, or something like that. And they're just so fed up with it that they don't want to even talk about it anymore. What do you say to that person?
I relate. I mean, I sympathize. Yes, I have a lot of ambivalence about the word gender because of it's become something of an empty signifier. You know, it means so many different things at once. And so I wrestled for a long time whether, and there are different views in the Christian world about this, right? There are some who make the argument that we shouldn't use the term gender anymore at all. We should just use sex. Of course, sex also has a double meaning, which is unhelpful at times, right? I mean, if I were to write a book called The Theology of Sex, I bet like 80% of you would think it was about one thing, and it's actually about something else, right? So we're kind of left with this, you know, with two loaded words that mean multiple things. And so I think I've kind of, in terms of using the term, I think a lot of people intuitively use gender and sex interchangeably. And although this is like a major faux pas in the world of gender studies, I actually think it's something to lean into. Because I think the way that we use the terms gender and sex has become so divided that actually using the term gender in a way that's connected to maleness and femaleness, it's connected right to the gen root, to the generativity. I think that can be a way of adding clarity. But you have to be very careful about that. So, like in the law, for example, I think it's very important to use the term sex and in other contexts. But yeah, I also understand the burnout. I think the problem is we can't just say, well, I'm so sick of this conversation, I don't want to think about it anymore, because it's affecting our world in very real ways, and it's affecting people's lives in very real ways. Because it's a kind of debate about something that gets at the core of who we are, right? So if we don't get it right, then there's a lot of kind of downstream effects, both at the individual level, but also at the familial and social and cultural level, and certainly the ecclesial level. I think it's very important for churches to get this right when there's so much debate in our time. So we can take breaks, but we can't totally peace out on the conversation, I think. Yeah.
A question over here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Favale. I'm in my junior year in the music education program here at UK, so needless to say, I'm very familiar with the gender unicorn. And I just have a question for you in regards to academia and raising younger generations, being an educator and engaging in conversations, just how you found yourself navigating conversations surrounding gender, and I guess more importantly, just being respectful towards students and coworkers who are very involved with the paradoxical sides of gender that you've discussed this evening. Just kind of what advice you would have in navigating conversations like that, where on one side it's legislated that you can't even say certain things, or I don't know, how do you honor both your faith and the students and educators around you?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tricky question, and there's not like a simple answer, right? Something that has to be discerned kind of continually in your interactions with people, discerning when or whether a conversation would be helpful or not. Sometimes I think it can be counterproductive in certain circumstances. I think one of the frustrating things about the conversation in our current time is that it's framed in a way that in order to respect someone, you have to completely endorse what they believe. And I think that's a weird idea. And I think it's an idea that we don't accept in almost any other area. I think most people would readily agree that, yeah, of course I can have deep respect or even a friendship with someone of another religion. My husband was an atheist for 7 years of our marriage, right? So we had profoundly different worldviews, but yet we not only respected each other, but shared a life of love together. So I think in this area, we also need to kind of push back against the framework, which is that in order to respect someone, you have to completely endorse their framework. And on the other hand, there's a flip side to that, which is like in order to reject someone's framework, you have to reject the person. And I think the Christian approach is to critique frameworks and at times to reject frameworks, but to never reject persons. And to have a sense of kind of curiosity about what someone thinks or what someone experiences. Because another thing I've learned in navigating this conversation is that people who have different experiences of gender, they vary widely. Like someone who identifies as non-binary might have a completely different reason for identifying that way than another person. You can't assume from the outset why someone might be using a certain kind of language to articulate their experience. So you have to show kind of humility and curiosity about that person's experience. And so I think in some ways we have to just kind of remember things that we know about treating other people with love and respect, but also having a kind of integrity of being grounded in our own worldview and not kind of professing or endorsing an idea. That's the thing. Like, ideologies don't deserve respect. People deserve respect. But we don't owe allegiance to ideologies. Ideologies aren't made in the image of God, you know. So I think maybe holding that kind of distinction between kind of the person and then the framework can sometimes be helpful. Yeah.
One thing that I've observed, and I've just been curious always if there's a response that the subjectivists have to this, is what appears to me to be a contradiction, and I would think that you might have an understanding of how they would respond to this. But when you think about someone like you talked about, like even at a very young age or at any point really coming to this realization that I am this thing, like they would say, I feel this way. The idea of saying I feel like I am a woman or I feel like I am a man has to be importing the notion of those identities from this pre-existing construct that they're rejecting. Like, how can you say I feel like a woman or I feel like a man or I believe myself to be this thing without first acknowledging that that thing exists as a truth, as a reality?
Right.
You know, is there a response to that contradiction?
I mean, I don't know. I also see that circular logic, and I don't have a way to kind of steel man that. You know, to say that a woman is someone who identifies as a woman never actually defines the word woman, right? So there's this kind of circularity to it, I think, that is a real critique of that perspective. And I also think that it's impossible to know from the outside what it feels like to be something that you are not, right? I think we can feel like or identify with something that we imagine it might be like, right? I can imagine what it might, I keep talking about my cat today, I don't know why, but I can imagine what it's like to be a cat. But I'm still coming at that from a human perspective, right? It's kind of a human construct of what catness is. Okay, I can't know that reality from the inside. So I think that's another kind of flaw. But what I think might be a helpful way of thinking about it is that when someone says, I don't know, like I'm the cliche, right? Like I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, right? I think they're expressing something that's metaphorically true, but not literally true. And so I think it's helpful to kind of dig into that, like what is being expressed through that metaphor, right? What are they expressing about their experience by feeling an affinity with the opposite sex, right? So sometimes I think a helpful distinction to make is between experience and essence. And I think gender subjectivism says, well, the essence is the experience, right? What you experience is your essence. But I think the perspective I'm offering is that, well, no, actually you can receive and listen to someone's experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that determines their essence, right? And so I think it's helpful to kind of disaggregate those things that gender subjectivism conflates.
Thank you for your talk, Doctor. It seems right to me on one hand that we want to kind of reject a lot of just banal stereotyping, right? Like I think, you know, attributing courage as like a stereotypically masculine virtue is flawed. That like I want to say that Edith Stein in the concentration camps rightfully exhibits courage, or that it's unfair to Stein that she's denied an opportunity at a professorship because she's a woman. However, on the other side, I also want to acknowledge not only that there are real differences between male and female and masculine and feminine, but that there's like a positive goodness to masculinity. There's a positive goodness to femininity, that we might say there's a privilege of being a woman. or are there tools or resources within the framework of Christian personalism that we can accurately and, in a way, reverently do justice to the image of God in each person as masculine or as feminine without sliding into just kind of casual stereotyping or like oppressive cultural boundaries?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I like that question a lot. And since you brought up Edith Stein, I'll draw from her work in my answer. So a kind of threefold framework that I find helpful that I got from Edith, I'll refer to her as if we're on first name basis. She's a Catholic philosopher and martyr and was martyred in Auschwitz. Amazing woman. Anyway, she talks about gender on 3 levels, or human identity, I should say. She talks about human identity on 3 levels. So one is the level of the human. So at the level of the human, when we talk about men and women, what's on the level of the human we share. So when it comes to the range of human virtues, we all have the capacity to develop those virtues, whether that's humility or courage or whatever you want to name. So we all have that kind of shared human capacity. But then there's the level of sexual difference. Okay, and here there's a very distinct bodily difference. And here it might be helpful actually sometimes to have conversations about averages, because what stereotypes often name are averages. What might be average, what might be true on average of men or true on average of women. So here at that level, it can be helpful to talk about what's distinctive when we look kind of at the aggregate groupings of men and women. But then there's also the level of the individual. And here, the level of the individual might not show up as the average when it comes to their sex, right? So here, after all, an average, it's always going to include outliers, okay? So the level of the individual matters because sometimes an individual man might not exhibit traits that are necessarily typical of men in general, but nonetheless, that's also part of God's creative vision for humanity. That's also part of God's creative design, is the unrepeatability and uniqueness of each individual person. So I think keeping those 3 categories in mind is really helpful, because most theories of gender take 2 of them and get rid of the other ones. So like traditional kind of polarity theories of gender, where like men and women are, like men are from Mars, women are from Venus, like we can't even communicate because we have like waffle and spaghetti brains or whatever. Like that's, I think, exaggerates that middle level and overlooks the common shared humanity and also the variation of the individual. Contemporary gender theories then sometimes overemphasize or completely overlook that middle distinction and just look at like, oh, we're all just like human, neuter, androgynous people, or like there's so much variation that basically every person is a gender. Okay, so I think if we keep all 3 of those levels in mind, that helps us kind of from falling into some of these extremes that most theories of gender pull toward.
I'd like to actually follow up on that subject of the masculine and the feminine, particularly since we're here at the Lewis House. If you've read Lewis's Space Trilogy, you may remember that he portrays what we call the angels, he calls the Eldilla, as masculine and feminine, although they're not male or female.
Yeah.
And I think particularly in Paralandra, the Eldil of the planet Venus, Ransom, who's the main character, just has an overwhelming awareness that she's supremely feminine, and the Eldil of Mars, supremely masculine. But these are not bodily facts at all, and they're not really rooted to procreation or sexuality in a biological sense. And I think this is really an important question, partly because men want to be masculine, by and large, and women want to be feminine. But it's not always easy to know what that means and what that looks like. So I think it's important to give some thought to what does it mean to be masculine or feminine, not falling into the traps that I think you're rightly pointing out, but trying to see what the real truth of it is. So I just like your thoughts about that.
Yeah, this is a good question, and it's one I'm still mulling over. So this is sort of open-ended thoughts on this. I I think Lewis might be a little too Neoplatonic about gender in this sense. And so I think where I'm coming from, when I'm talking especially about gender in human beings, it very much is rooted in a bodily reality. Now, I think there's interesting things you can maybe extrapolate from the bodily reality, so I don't want to like totally foreclose that kind of a discussion about like, you know, some sort of Platonic archetype of the masculine or the feminine. But when I think about masculinity and femininity from a Christian perspective, I see like masculinity in this positive kind of strong sense that we want. And I agree, like the earlier question, we need like positive, strong accounts and narratives about masculinity and femininity. I think that's one of the problems of our culture now is we have these very kind of negative scripts about, you know, to be female is to be a victim, and to be a masculine is to be kind of a predator, right? These are very like negative narratives. So we need positive narratives. But when I really think about masculinity in that sense, I think it's about male holiness. And femininity, true femininity, is female holiness. So it's about manifesting holiness as either a male or female person. And that so masculinity and femininity is the living out of holiness in the bodies that we have. I think that's one level, I would say. So that provides a kind of aspirational aspect to being a man or a woman, right? In other words, to become a real man, to become a full flourishing kind of man means to develop in virtue, to develop in holiness, and the same would be true for women. But I still think there is room for that other conversation about whether or not we can describe, I mean, in the Catholic circles we talk about, sometimes you'll hear the phrase like the feminine genius and the masculine genius. And sometimes the feminine genius is talked about as a kind of particular prophetic attention or prophetic wisdom of the value of the human person and the value of life. So this kind of attention to the realm of the personal. And I think there might be some truth in that. So I think there's an interesting conversation to have about that, as long as we don't end up with definitions of masculinity and femininity that basically divide the pie of human traits and virtues into these fractions and cut off each sex from developing as a whole human being. So that would be a kind of guardrail I'd want to put up in that conversation.
Dr. Favale, I have one over here, and then we have one in the back corner.
I have a what might be a lighthearted question, but maybe not. I'll see. So some other Lewis House scholars and I recently watched the Barbie movie, and I don't know if you've seen it, but I went in thinking it was going to be kind of frivolous and silly, and then I was surprised that it is a somewhat serious movie, and it seems like it's saying something about our culture's current take on gender. I don't know if the message is entirely coherent. It seems somewhat confused to me.
Yeah.
But first, I wanted to ask: do you have any, reads of the movie? And then second, if you don't, do you have any thoughts on why that movie became so popular? Because it did seem like it was a kind of a cultural phenomenon in the summer that it came out.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah. I don't have this like fully formed theory of Barbie, but some of the things I noticed that these seem like very small moments in the movie, but I found them to be perhaps, it struck me that maybe there's like different levels of subversion happening, that there's a more kind of obvious subversiveness, but then there's even a more like subversion of that. Like for example, in the very beginning when it talks about Midge, the like pregnant Barbie that everyone hated and nobody bought, I thought that is so spot on, because like in our time, what we think of as like the ideal man, ideal woman has been completely divorced from generativity. And it's about these more kind of artificial aesthetic expressions of masculinity and femininity, right? They're like de-sexed and degendered, and no one wants like, we don't want like pregnant Barbie. We don't want to be reminded of that. And then at the very last scene where, sorry, spoiler if you haven't seen it, when Barbie, she becomes human, and the very last scene is she's like going to the gynecologist. which I also loved because I was like, yeah, like now that you're a real woman, like that's what it means to be a real woman, is to have a certain kind of body, right? So there seemed to be this like undercurrent of like a critique of how we've divorced gender from embodiment, which I appreciated, as well as this maybe more overt kind of critique of how masculinity and femininity have become very artificial and trivial and performative and shallow in our time. So, yeah, it was an interesting movie to watch for those reasons. So, yeah.
Hello, Dr. Favale. Thank you so much for coming tonight, despite the tough loss for the Irish last night. Felt for you guys, but you know. But nonetheless, thank you so much for being here. So in light of yesterday's executive order signed by Donald Trump that the federal government can only now recognize two sexes, my question is, what do you think the federal government's role is in distinguishing the genders or sexes? And how do you think they're doing at that right now?
It's been like 12 hours. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think one of the like 200 executive orders. So I don't actually, yeah, anyway. It is important for laws to be clear. And one of the downsides of the kind of equivocation and confusion about gender is that linguistic confusion is, there are some efforts to put that linguistic confusion into law, which would undermine rights and protections based on sex, which would affect women in a negative way. And so I think it is very important for sex-based rights and protections to be preserved, and for the legal language to be very clear about that. Because, like, for example, in the Equality Act that never got passed but that was being proposed, sex in terms of the law was redefined as like sex/gender identity/sexual orientation, which creates this just kind of super confusing mess. Because then when you have a debate about certain rights, like for example, whether male prisoners should have access to women's prisons, right, if they kind of self-identify as women, well, there you have like gender identity and sex kind of in conflict, but if the law conflates those things linguistically, then how can we actually, it just creates this murky mess, basically. So I think it's very important for laws to be very clear in their language and for the reality of sex to be protected. I don't think executive orders are the best way to do that, because in 4 years we could get another president who just writes another executive order. So it's kind of a temporary sort of solution. But I think, yes, we definitely need clarity in these terms when it comes to the law.
I think we'll take a few more questions. I have a couple here up in the middle section.
In the midst of the gender dysphoria, we're all looking for hope. Toward the end of your book, The Genesis of Gender, you share testimony about someone who interrupted their conversion of their sexuality by another conversion. And I wonder if you would take a few moments and just share that story. I found it hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the last chapter of my book, The Genesis of Gender, I tell the story of a young woman named Daisy, who for a time identified and partially medically transitioned, well, actually, took testosterone and also had a mastectomy, and then experienced a conversion to Christianity and also eventually detransitioned. And so her kind of story of gender is very much wrapped up in her story of faith. And since writing the book, actually for the last year and a half or so, I've been working on a project. It's an audio documentary that interviews Christians who experience gender dysphoria and kind of just telling their stories, which include people who have experienced gender dysphoria who've never medicalized, some who have, some who've detransitioned, so kind of the whole gamut. And it's really humbling to listen to these stories because, God is at work in the midst of this experience. And so for the men and women who I've talked with who've shared their stories with me in different ways, this is like the paradox of Christianity, that the cross becomes a gift, and that a certain kind of suffering or distress, when really entrusted to God, he can transform that. It can become a means of sanctification in our lives. And so it's not even just that one isolated story in the book, which I would encourage you to read. It's a beautiful story. But there are so many other stories about, that are like that, that's why it's so important that we can't just close our hearts and turn our backs on people who are having these experiences, because God is at work in these people's lives, and they're people who are in the church. They're not out there somewhere that we need to protect ourselves from. But God can enter into this experience as well, and it can become a source of real conversion, not kind of fake conversion. I think that's one of the appeals of this framework, is that it promises a kind of it's almost like it promises something that Christianity promises and can fulfill, right? Become a new person, put on the new self, cast off the old self. It promises this transformation, becoming who you really are, right? And those desires are good. Those are the desires that can be fulfilled by God. So I think it's really important to kind of hear the stories of people who have found God in the midst of these experiences as well.
I've got 2 more questions, Dr. Favale, one here, and that'll wrap it up.
I just like this. Is this on? I'd like to circle back. I'd like to circle back to the use of the word gender, and it's not. I don't want to question that, but I'm old enough that, and I haven't lived in the world of academia, that I spent 2/3 of my life where the word gender referred to a word. I studied Latin in high school.
Linguistic.
When did it change? Well, maybe it goes back a long time in academia, but in my life, it seems it only changed, a short time ago.
Yeah, well, I think the shift really happens in the shift begins, I would say, in the 60s. And I kind of trace this genealogy in my book, actually, this shift, when some sex researchers named John Money and then Robert Stoller, I believe, begin they kind of import the term gender from linguistics to name, Stoller uses it to name gender identity, Money uses it to name kind of more the cultural expressions. And then from John Money's work, feminist thought really latches onto that idea of gender. And then it becomes, in the 70s, entrenched in academia, and then eventually more in kind of popular culture. So that's really where the shift happens. It kind of begins in the late 60s, really becomes normalized in academia in the 70s, and then continues to kind of have different iterations into our time. But that's where the shift begins, I think, is in that time.
My question's related to that. I think for many people my age and older, it feels like this has been a relatively recent explosion of, if you will, gender confusion. And I'm curious to know, based on your study and research, to what do you attribute that at this era in history?
Yeah, I think something happened, really in 2014 was a real big moment. I think it was that year. Then Facebook was like, there are 30 genders you can choose from or something, which I think indicated a kind of mainstreaming or normalizing of something that had been lurking in different online communities. So I think the internet plays a huge role in this. Now, I think this is a very multifactorial phenomenon. So I don't want to say it's the internet, but it's the internet. There's a lot of stuff going on, but in terms of the kind of proliferation and it becoming the norm in pop culture, 2014 is really kind of the rise of social media. Actually, I have this whole intricate theory about how it started on Tumblr. Tumblr was this very specific kind of melting pot especially between like 2010 to 2013 or so, where a lot of kind of the lingo that we use for gender now actually became formulated. Like there are certain, even just phrases that originated on Tumblr, like demisexual and things like that. And Tumblr as a platform has this like tagging phenomenon where you like tag every aspect of your identity, right? And that again almost created this sort of theory of identity where we're defined by our different desires and associations, and each of those has a label, and so each person is kind of a collection, a cluster of labels. And then from Tumblr, which is kind of like the incubator of that, it kind of hit, then became Facebook, and kind of then hit mainstream and became more circulating in culture. And there's another factor, aside from just social media. I think the internet is it's a disembodied realm, right? Like how you exist on the internet is you basically curate an avatar, and you could be anyone. Like you could be a cat. I'm into cats right now, I guess. So like you could be a cat on the internet, because it's kind of detached from physical reality. And so in some ways, I think our immersion in that world, we're almost now attempting to take that that liquidity and malleability of identity that can exist online, like into the real world. And there's all kinds of other like pieces, I think, that are influenced by the internet in terms of, being connected into niche communities and getting in echo chambers. And so I think a lot of stuff that's happening in our culture couldn't happen at the scale that it's happening without the influence of the internet. So, yeah.
Folks, would you give it up for our speaker one more time, Abigail Favale? Well, folks, thank you so much for coming out to our January lecture. It is very cold. Be safe and warm. Just a couple final announcements. We do have books for sale on the back table. My friend Ava and Kate are back there at the book table. You can get a copy of Dr. Abigail Favale's book back there, The Genesis of Gender. We have a few other books you might want to look at. Our next lecture, Brian mentioned it earlier, is going to be Tuesday, February 4th. Dr. Julie Canlis. We're looking forward to having her, so please come out. Hopefully it's not as cold. But until then, we'll see you next time. Be safe. Stay warm.